period and is 0 if not. And so the reason I think this works, and we don't need to worry about this in general, is that by measuring the agent's ability to ensure it receives favorable observations about the world, means that we don't need to make choices about what's actually in the world. It could be anything. We don't need any ontology of things in the world or any actual even world model that corresponds to anything we'd agree with. All we need is a model over, given what I've seen so far, which observations do I expect to see next? And so this way of thinking about impact shifts from what's actually going on in the world. It makes it indexical. When you think about impact, it's with respect to you. So a bad impact, like I say in the post, is we might define it as decrease in my ability to achieve my goals. And if we take away the bad, we would see that it's change in ability to achieve goals. And so this is with respect to the agent. If the agent's goal is to essentially, if the trivial utility function that's just 1 if it's on the whole time and 0 otherwise, this measures power. It measures its ability to ensure it just remains on. It doesn't care about anything in the world, but it measures how much power it has, how well it's able to reason, what its vantage point is essentially. And so then if we consider an agent trying to take off, well, how can you take off without increasing your ability to remain on in the future? If you supposed, well, okay, I'm considering this thing that will improve my algorithms or ensure that people can't turn me off. Well, you compare not doing the thing. So if you don't do the thing, you're more able to be shut off. You're less likely to ensure that you can remain on. And then if you compare to doing the thing, you're now in a better position to achieve that goal. So we've effectively abstracted away the notion of what's going on in the world, and we view it as a more fundamental statement about what it means for the agent to be acting and pursuing goals. So does that answer your question, or is it still somewhat confusing?
Somewhat. I think it answers the question and then opens up a few more questions that I have.
Sure.
I'd like to just take a few seconds to think about my next question if I can.
Yeah, sure.
Any other questions? Then I can perhaps take one. Stuart Armstrong. I'll get to you in just a moment, Roald. Stuart Armstrong has written a follow-up post where he says he believes that this algorithm will be vulnerable to wireheading. Do you agree with his assessment?
I do not. So I think it's a reasonable thing to point out, and I'm glad he did. I probably should have made it more clear. So in the post, there's a section where I talk about different ways maybe you could game this particular formulation, and I'd like to emphasize keeping the formulation away from the question of whether this is the conceptual core of impact. So because the formulation is one specific attempt to formalize that, and so in discussing that, I mentioned, well, here's one thing you could do. You could do observational wireheading, where you build some device that it detects whether you're, pursuing other goals, and if you are, it makes sure that you're only as able to pursue those other goals as if you've done nothing, and otherwise, it gives you as much of your normal utility as you want. And so I talked about this and a couple other methods, and then I presented something that basically tries to detect whether you're moving towards your main goal, which purportedly you're trying to do in a low impact way, or whether you're doing something that doesn't have anything to do with it, which would be, which would include attempts to get around the impact measure penalty. And it seems that this, what I provided, does disallow all the proposed workarounds that have been noticed so far. And so there does not, in my opinion, seem to be a way to break this right now, modulo the flaws, which aren't really breaking it, but just other questions. So it doesn't seem like there's a way to break it right now. And I think there's good reason to hope that it's either true that we can't, or that we're very much within distance of making sure we can't. I think it's an open question as to whether this test also catches too many false positives, but that is another topic.
So I think my follow-up question will probably have been, in extent of that, well, if you are not making it care about the actual world, which is in my opinion at least very possible to do, what are you making it care about exactly? There is some confusion for me that I don't quite understand.
So it cares about the actual world, or the penalty functions, the things we're measuring, change in our ability to achieve the goals. They do incorporate information about the world through the model that says, what do I expect to see next given what I've seen so far? And implicitly, that's going to have some representation of things going on in the world.
Sure, okay.
And so, my assertion is that we don't necessarily need to be aware of these specific things changing in the world to get the effect of this agent won't move too far in one direction to change the world from the way it is now, as measured, by its ability to achieve different goals. We're saying it can't reach these really high impact, undesirable plans without incurring an extremely large penalty in this formulation. And I'm saying that this is a way of doing it that doesn't depend on any specific details of what's in the world, but I think we have good reason to suspect that it'll preserve them. Maybe they'd be more clear. I think it's kind of hard to unpack exactly why that is in a compact way if you haven't read the post. But
it's only gonna care about the parts of the world that it gets information from, right? So I feel like it just be incentivized to make sure that it keeps that exact part as close to what it was before, and then it doesn't have to care about any of the other parts which it's not currently observing or currently aware of existing, or however you want to define whatever it's observing about the world, right?
So I'm not quite sure I understand. Could you rephrase?
Well, it seems to me that the AI is actually not incentivized to keep the world intact if you're not defining exactly what parts of the world we want to maintain. When you're only making it care about maintaining the observations it's having, it's not incentivized to maintain anything outside that observation space. So it's going to be, incentivized to hack that observation space to be as close to how the world is currently looking, but then all the parts that it's not currently observing, it would not at all care about. And that to me seems like it could prove very problematic.
So the difference here is I think you might be thinking of, it's not measuring change in the actual observations it's going to see. It's measuring change in its ability to string together favorable observations. And so this is like a very different thing. And I think it's like one of the ways I see I think this is like a very reasonable pattern match. And it's probably one I would do as well. Where there's a different concept here of, well, it's not what it actually expects to see, but its ability to produce these favorable observations, which inherently captures information about other parts of the world, about its vantage point. And so by constraining what it expects to see in particular, would actually have little to no regularizing effect on the penalty, or change in gaming the penalty. I don't think that would be very related, and that's due to the formalization.
So first, I would like to say that it's I really like this. I have one question. Do you have any open problems with these unknowns?
With the unknown unknowns?
Yeah.
Could you give me?
Well, previous questions that were kind of related to it, that if there is something that the agent doesn't know, then how much effort will the agent take, for example, to find out the things that might be useful to know in order to not limit its future options and so on?
So if the way I understand the question is this a question of, well, how's this affected by the agent's ignorance about, maybe its model isn't complete or it just hasn't gotten enough information? So I think that if generally agents with incomplete models, they don't have much predictive power, we would expect them to be much less likely to act because their models would have more noise in it. So any given action would be more likely of producing change in its expected ability to pursue a goal after, in the long-term penalty, it might wait a considerable amount of time and then try to reach that goal and compare, its ability to do that after not acting with its ability to do that after acting. And if your model isn't very precise, you might, expect to see a larger shift there. And so I think that is in general a problem. Well, if our agent doesn't know this thing, then it might, it's not going to take it into account, which is different from the intuition prompt. But having an incomplete model, I would expect that prompt to be somewhat helped by this formulation. And in addition, it's also less likely to do things as soon as it realizes the effects are big without us needing to tell the agent that the effects are bad, which is basically always sooner. And it seems like a desirable property. So I think, it's not impervious to that, but I think in practicality, agents probably wouldn't be able to have a gigantic change before they're good enough to try to have that gigantic change by modeling its effects and pursuing the desirable outcome.
I believe that it's a very, very good model. I'm just curious, have you tried out anything where the agent needs to explicitly go somewhere and do something in order to find out more? Have you modeled such scenarios?
I would expect the value of information to calculations to basically be the same. Just modulo that it's new objective. So I'm not sure that it would be a special consideration for this. So I haven't done that.
So I have a question, and that is: imagine that you have an agent implementing this, which gets a new action. Let's call it simplify, an action that can simplify the environment in some way, but doesn't have a particular large impact. It doesn't stop it from doing a lot of things because it's purely some way to simplify its environment. It would, as I can see, the algorithm would take this just about always. Do you agree with that? Not always. That's too sad.
It feels a little underspecified, but it sounds like reasonable if it's not really. It's just kind of something that makes it more convenient for its own goal, but doesn't really change other goals. And but I agree.
Okay, I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah.
Are there any goals or commands that you can give to this agent that it will resist?
That it will.
Maybe
what?
there are some taxonomy of reasons it will resist your goals.
That it'll resist the goals we try to maybe change its we want to change its formulation perhaps to give it a different objective, you mean?
I don't mean anything specific. I'm just curious in open-ended way. Is there any kind of, for example, maybe you give it some goal that will limit its future options very strongly, and then maybe it decides that it's stupid goal and it will not do it.
Yeah, so if we were going to implement code that would decrease, it would not be good for its current utility function, then this would now be the default, and so it would be heavily inclined to accept it. And I think there's this immediate kind of corrigibility where the default case is it gets changed or shut down. And I think this is heavily increased by the formulation. It doesn't seem to, it's not clear whether it does the same thing for all kinds of corrigibility we'd want. In particular, knowing exactly when you're on this, it's not going to help with that. But I think that in addition to seemingly defining low impact, it also brings a lot of additional corrigibility. So.
I maybe would expand on the question. Assume that there are different people involved with this agent. Let's say the manufacturer, then the owner, and finally the user. and maybe the manufacturer and the owner do not want that the user gives some certain goals to the agent, then how to implement it?
So what would happen is if the agent wouldn't, if what the outcome by default would be the user ends up implementing this this change, then the agent wouldn't take steps to make sure that doesn't happen. So I guess this problem would really come down to how we want to handle it, and that would be more of a human kind of mechanism design or management design problem, as I understand it. So that wouldn't be really within the scope of attainable utility preservation.
What do you see as the next step in your research?
So the next step, I think, is to I think the formulation needs to be relaxed in some ways. I think it's very exciting that it appears to not like we have a formulation and we might have good reason to hope that, we've tried to come up with these ways of gaming it so far and none of them work, and seems like the concept will scale to all the way. So then the question is, can we make sure that for every task we want it to do, we aren't turning too many of the actual good actions as false positives? I think this is plausible that we're not, but I'd like to make that even more clear. And I think they'll also some people are saying, well, I'm a little bit uneasy because this particular formulation flags something that I view as low impact. And so I think that would be a good next step. Then from there, looking at issues of embedded agency or make it more tractable. And I'd also think I would like to go and walk through a little more slowly, because I think that I basically just tried to put too much in that one post, and I kind of went too quickly. I think a lot of people raised really good points, but there were also some assertions, which I'm glad were made, and it seems like people's confusions, the more confused comments are also the more upvoted comments, so I'm kind of wondering whether I didn't communicate some key aspects. One of the things I think that I'd like to emphasize more is this as a new Gears level model of what's happening for agents as they consider plans and as they execute plans, as it moves them through outcome space, through attainable utility space. Maybe we now have a model for instrumental convergence, and this seems like a very natural concept for alignment. I expect it to be very useful for other problems as well. And so I think the open questions, there's probably a lot of low-hanging fruit there as well, and we'll see how much of it I can deal with on my own, and there's probably room for other people to step in if they're interested.
What are there any particular parts that you feel would be helpful for other people to step in? Any particular directions that might require a lot of work, but might not be very mathematically heavy or requiring coding skills or whatever? What parts do you need help with, basically?
So I think one of the least heavy parts would be, not requiring anything beyond what's really in the post, is coming up with these ways of relaxing the impact measure. That is also kind of a mechanism design problem right now. It doesn't feel like it should be, any more difficult than some of the other problems I dealt with while developing it. But, it's a school year and I don't necessarily have as much time as I did during the summer. So, help with intent verification and kind of coming up with ideas. Well, what's the simple boundary between behaviors and plans that try to just skirt the penalty and ones that are actually low impact and are actually just ways of pursuing the agent's main goal? And I think if we can get that down and, have really good reason to say, yep, this is going to do what we want, it's going to draw that clean line, I think that would be really, really helpful. And so that'd be the first thing to come to mind.
Okay, any other questions? Well, then I would like to say thank you very much, Alexander, for coming to this reading group.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a
Thank
pleasure.
you.
So the next part of the reading group is the Formalia, which is you're of course welcome to stay. That is